Good morning, everyone. I'm Jonathan Horst, the Director of Conservation and Research for Tucson Audubon. Starting a few years ago, thanks to the initiative of Jenny McFarland, our bird conservation biologist, we began our initial efforts to study desert martins as part of our Important Bird Areas program. We started off collaborating with a few others interested in this generally unknown subspecies of martin. First, though, let's set the stage. It's hot, 108 degrees Fahrenheit. There's no shade to be found, and the humidity is in the single digits. It's so dry it hurts to breathe. These are the conditions that greet the desert martins, the Hesperia subspecies, when they return to their breeding grounds in the Sonoran Desert. These are also the conditions faced by those of us who are trying to learn more about them so that we can better their long-term odds of survival, for they face numerous threats. Since many of you may not be aware that this subspecies even exists, here's a quick overview. Though purple martins as a species are very well studied, the desert martins are not. What's unknown heavily outweighs what is known. Some of the basics, they migrate late. They're the last subspecies to show up on the Purple Martin Conservation Association's spring migration map, often arriving in late May and into June. Like the other purple martins, they're cavity nesters. However, they nest almost exclusively in cavities in the two giant columnar cactus of the Sonoran Desert, the well-known saguaros and the massive cardons of northern Sonora, Mexico. There are only a handful of records of them nesting elsewhere, and there are no records of them nesting in any type of human-crafted nest box. They seem to nest in small groups rather than colonies, with only 3 or 4 pairs within a quarter mile of each other, constituting a colony. They're smaller than the other subspecies. The females have a different coloration pattern, and the males have a noticeable distinction in their songs compared to the other subspecies. The major unknowns include basically everything. Where do they overwinter? What's their migration route? Do they use the same saguaros every year, or the same specific cavity year to year? Do they nest in family groups, or do they disperse? What's the major prey base during the breeding season? They seem to be really patchily distributed. What makes for good habitat? And from the applied conservation side, will they nest in a human-created cavity if we could create a nest box that was in the right location with the right characteristics? What are those characteristics? What would they look like? Obviously, desert martins are cool birds. Everyone in this conference loves purple martins, right? But why is it that Tucson Audubon is investing so much in learning about and conserving desert martins right now? Why should you care? Well, there are 3 major known threats for martins here, and they're all about habitat. And that means saguaros. Without a doubt, the most critical issue is fire. It's immediate, long-term, and something that can be readily addressed. Second is climate change, and the third is urban encroachment. The Sonoran Desert doesn't burn. Well, it didn't. Plants are generally spaced out too far for fire to carry. So saguaros and most of the other native plants can't handle fire. It kills them. But in 2018, we had our first bufflegrass-driven fire that killed lots of saguaros. Then in 2020, 2 major fires, one near Tucson and one near Phoenix, burned a combined 300,000 acres, killing tens of thousands of saguaros. Like the inset photo, saguaros don't have to look burned after a fire to be dead. Their roots are so shallow, and bufflegrass burns so hot at about 1400 degrees Fahrenheit that they can still look perfect, but just be waiting for the next stiff breeze to push them over. And since things grow so slowly here, regeneration of fully functional saguaro habitat, and therefore fully functional purple martin habitat, takes well over a century, probably closer to 2 centuries left to natural processes. That's why 3 years ago, Tucson Audubon started our invasive plant department, and now we have 15 full-time staff. That's a third of our organization devoted to saving saguaros and all the species that depend on them. The hillside in this photo is covered with bufflegrass. The light green on the left is healthy and will create quite a problem during the next dry season. On the right side is an area that we've treated. The bufflegrass is already turning brown and will begin to decompose, preventing the risk of catastrophic fires. And don't worry, we treated the rest of the hillside a couple days later. Climate. Saguaros and cardons to the south are found only in the Sonoran Desert, and their range is limited by freezes, which are on the increase, and by their establishment phase. They are picky plants. They need 2 good wet monsoon seasons with a warm, wet winter in between. Now, we're in the middle of a 30-year mega drought. There's not much new recruitment happening to maintain saguaro habitat long into the future. There's lots of different climate models out there, and for saguaros, they're all showing pretty much the same thing. Tiny bits of expansion, the blue, in western Arizona, and significant contraction, the red, which is mostly in northwestern Sonora, but also occurs in Arizona. Urban encroachment. Each of the yellow icons is where we found a nest around Tucson. You'll notice that none of them are in urban areas, and there are only a couple that are in sort of ex-urban, ultra-low density habitat population areas. Cities in Arizona are growing at an incredible rate, and each new development levels a section of desert. And even though the saguaros are saved, marten habitat is lost. We're working with the city of Tucson to update its native plant preservation statutes and to guide some development practices, but neither approach will effectively help purple martens since they seemingly need large intact areas of desert and avoid nesting in developed areas. Now, timelines. Being a desert ecosystem, restoring desert marten habitat, the Sonoran Desert upland that has mature saguaros, takes multiple lifetimes. And I mean multiple of our lifetimes, not just of the martens. So Tucson Audubon has started a really ambitious program of replanting saguaros in areas that have burned and also planting them in areas that are anticipated to become saguaro habitat. We've already got 14,000 saguaro babies growing. These will all be planted in ex-urban, rural, and protected wildland areas that can become functional desert marten habitat within the next few years. But recognizing that it'll take 100 years at least before these saguaros are large enough to host marten nests, we're also beginning to try to develop saguaro replicating nest boxes. Now, let's switch gears a bit. We often say that the desert martens are the wildest of the purple martens due to their summering habitat and that they don't use any type of human-crafted nest box. As alluded to at the start of the presentation, there are quite a few conditions that differ between studying these desert martens compared to studying the other subspecies. The first is weather. Breeding happens during our summer monsoon season. For those of you who haven't experienced it, we're talking about patchy, usually incredibly intense thunderstorms that are scattered as a patchwork on a background of 105-degree heat. And there's no shade. Second, pokey things. People love to joke that everything in the desert's out to get you, when really everything in the desert's just trying to protect itself. The saguaros and cardons in which martens nest are thickly covered with stiff spines. They grow in areas surrounded by other plants with spines, cholla, prickly pear cactus, gray thorns, wolfberries. Even all the trees near them are covered in thorns. To make it worse, saguaros require those thorny trees for protection when they're small. So, unless they've outlived their nurse plant, that thorny tree or bush that kept it alive when it was little, they're hard to even get to. Third, marten nests are generally way up in saguaros. If you find a nest that's only 10 feet off the ground, that is incredibly accessible, and you are lucky. 20 feet up is a lot more common, and sometimes they're even 30 feet high. Unlike a well-designed apartment complex for a colony of eastern martens, we can't lower the nests to do nest checks or banding or any type of monitoring. We use endoscopes on telescoping 30-foot poles to do the best that we can for nest checks. We're not even quite sure yet how we're going to get chicks out of the rigid saguaro boots. That's what we call the calloused cavity that forms after a Gila woodpecker or gilded flicker excavates the cavity. We don't know how we're going to get chicks out of there, though we're going to be attempting to do that with Joe and Dr. Buck and some others starting next week. This is what a nest check looks like from the side view and from the view of the endoscope itself. So far, this is about as good as it gets with endoscope-based nest monitoring. We can't always get an exact count of the number of eggs or chicks that are in there, and we almost never get the photogenic images that we'd like. It's really hard to finagle just the right angle with the endoscope to look down inside the saguaro boot. And this video will show you why it's so difficult. So here we are going up and up and up, and there's the cavity. We're going in, and okay, it's got to focus. All right, yes, it is shaky, but that's what you get on a 30-foot pole. I assure you, it's not as easy as it looks, and it's definitely not as easy as we would have liked it to be. Getting up to a 20-foot high nest with an endoscope is a bit of a trick, not to mention getting up there on a ladder to get to the nestlings. Now, put that saguaro on a steep hillside comprised of loose and irregular rock and still surrounded by all those pokey things, and you start to get a picture of how difficult it is to do this monitoring. Now, our colonies are really spread out, as I indicated earlier. They're usually not close to roads, and when you get there, you're maybe aiming for a group of 2 to 4 nests. So if you add together carrying a tall ladder and an endoscope and all your supplies for maybe a quarter mile on or off a trail, the fact that we still don't know the best processes for accessing a very well-protected nest and tight time constraints with a short breeding season, it's a pretty high investment of time and effort for low numbers in return. Further conservation for desert martins. We're trying to learn more about them. For a couple years, we've been mapping where they nest, and we're collecting attributes of nest cavities themselves in our efforts to develop artificial nest boxes that they might use. We've gotten some basic life history data already, clutch sizes and timing, but the really exciting things are starting next. We'll be working with Joe and the Purple Martin Conservation Association, Dr. Lauren Buck from Northern Arizona University, Dr. Doug Horst from the University of Arizona, and others to begin looking at migration routes, overwintering locations, ecotoxicology, whether they're picking up toxins in the environment from their food sources, and a host of other pieces of information. In the meantime, though, we'll continue working to protect their habitat from invasive species and to do our climate adaptation and protection. If you'd like to get involved, regardless of your location, there are a couple of things you can do. One is this fall we'll be starting a design challenge to develop novel nest boxes that might meet the needs of desert martins based on the sets of nest cavity criteria that we've collected. Second, we're always looking for input or advances for bettering our methodology for getting to the nests and characterizing those nest metrics. We're definitely open to any input on the best way to net adults or to get to the nestlings deep in those small cavities, small entrance cavities. And 4, you could sponsor a saguaro. I'd like to thank Jenny for getting this project started and Olia for doing a major amount of the field work. Private donors have helped fund the work, and countless volunteers have helped us find nests and do nest checks. The Wildlife Conservation Society's Climate Adaptation Fund and the Coronado and Tonto National Forests have helped fund our work on saguaro protection, invasive plant control, and experimental nest box work. And thanks to our numerous collaborators along the way and those that make their work possible.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So excited to finally be diving into these desert purple martins. And thanks to you guys and yeah, Tucson Audubon for being really the boots on the ground to do this work.
Certainly, yeah, we're really excited about every aspect of it that we're getting started.
Let's see what we got here. Oh, before we get too deep into the questions here, you mentioned that saguaro recruitment was really low. Would you mind explaining what recruitment is and why it might be so low? Why aren't there, more saguaros being recruited?
Yeah, so if you think about that picture with the timelines, that first picture on the left was a little 1-year-old seedling. It has 2 or 3 tiny, tiny little hair-like spines on top. And April, May, and June here are incredibly hot and dry, and all the plants around brown down. Most of them lose their leaves. And so every rabbit, kangaroo, rat, mouse, and everything else is looking for anything that has water in it. And so those tiny little saguaros are the perfect snack at that time of year. So part of what we need to do in terms of trying to restore or get new saguaros planted out is to be planting saguaros that are fully spined, so they're 2 or 3 years old. So recruitment means basically that they're surviving that baby stage and making it to adulthood. And we've got the critical survival window when the vast majority of even seeds that germinate die is in that first 2 years, and it's because of all that predation. And even to have any chance of survival, we've got to have 2 really wet monsoon summer seasons and a wet enough winter in between that enough of the other vegetation stays green so that everything's eating the other stuff instead of trying to find those tiny little saguaros. So that's the big recruitment issue for us, and this 30-year mega drought is certainly not helping things.
Yeah, just more evidence of climate change wreaking havoc on everything, including all the way from baby cactuses on the way up the chain to purple martins.
Yeah.
All right, we got a question in chat from Tim. He says, do cactus wrens predate martin nests?
Not that we're aware of. We haven't recorded it yet, but that's not to say that they don't.
Maria says she was wondering, and she's repeating herself. She says, but this is her area of interest. Do they gather in roosts after they finish breeding? Any purple martin roosts in Arizona?
There are. I didn't put that in because we've only got really, really loose preliminary data so far, and we don't have anything that's like big numbers, although total population size isn't big numbers. North of Tucson on the lower San Pedro River, there's a town called San Manuel. It seems like there's a small roost there with maybe 50 to 100 birds, and there used to be a nest in roost in central Tucson, but that wasn't there last year or the year before, I believe. And I think we've found 1 or 2 other areas that, whether they really qualify as pre-migration roosts or not, there were at least dozens of birds together for a day or 3.
Stephanie asks, are desert martins getting water from the cactuses and insects? Do they have less water requirements than the eastern species? Where are they getting their water from?
That's a great question. We're trying to figure that out as we're going through this process of trying to map where all of the nests are. And we're up to about, I think this year we've finally gotten up to 100 different saguaros that are known to have or had nests in the last 3 years. We're trying to look at the habitat around them to see what makes for good purple martin habitat, because there's saguaros everywhere. There are big saguaros everywhere. So it's not just the size or availability of the saguaros. There's something else that they're keying on to because for where they create their colonies. One of the ideas that we had is maybe there's some sort of surface water close by. A couple of the colonies are near to golf courses that have water features. I don't think they're getting their water from the cactus. That's generally a myth that animals, other than just by munching down on them, are going to get any water out of them. There's a whole lot of oxalates in there, except when they're really small. And whether they're getting enough moisture from the insects themselves, it's doubtful. We have seen them going to open surface water and drinking there, so we know that at least some places they're physically drinking. It would be really cool if they were like kangaroo rats and got all of their moisture from their diet, but it's pretty unlikely.
And finally here, we got Deb Westcott, PMCA Purple Martin update editor, asking, did you mention you can adopt a saguaro?
Yes, that's something that we're just getting ready to launch. Our development director's like, when are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? But in our effort to both get new saguaros planted out, as well as to protect the really big existing saguaros, one of the approaches that we thought we would take would be, kind of an adopt a saguaro approach, where it's like, if there's a mature nest saguaro, we're trying to come up with a price of what it costs per year to make sure that there are no invasive plants growing close to the base of that to protect that individual saguaro, and or what does it cost to get a little 2-year-old saguaro grown out and then planted and cared for a couple of years. So I don't have any numbers, but if that's something that you're interested in, it's something that we're very actively trying to roll out in the next month or so.
Sounds like a worthwhile thing to do to support the cacti and Tucson Audubon and purple martin. So, all right, thank you so much, Jonathan. If you don't mind, stick around and chat if there are any additional questions.